Let's go ahead and get the show on the road. Good morning. My name is Vijay Kannan, head of the management department in the Hunton School of Business here at Utah State University. Delighted to have you join us this morning for the third in our series of webinars focused on how do we bring lean education into the classroom. This morning, we're delighted to have with us Dr. Amit Daif. Amit is a professor in the Orfalea School of Business at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. He's going to be talking about how to use games as a pedagogical tool in the context of lean. Before we get started here, just a couple of things. We would certainly welcome your questions. So if you do have questions as the presentation progresses, feel free to post them in the Q&A box down there, and we will try to get to as many of those towards the end of the session. Be on the lookout. This is the third and last of the series thus far, but we're hoping that we will have a few more of these webinars as the summer progresses and into the fall. Again, I would encourage those of you who might have an interest in sharing your own insights and experiences teaching lean to send me a proposal. Would love to review that and get that out and make sure that we are sharing as many different perspectives and insights on how we might improve the lean curriculum and lean pedagogy for the many people who are going to be on our call this morning. So with that, turn it over to Amit. It's all yours.
Thank you, Vijay, and good morning, California time, and good afternoon if you guys are on the East Coast. It's a pleasure to be with you guys. And in this presentation, I'll be sharing some of the results from a research that I conducted earlier on the impact of gamification and using games for lean education, and try to have a pedagogical assessment of the impact of this approach in getting students better engaged and excited about studying lean and lean thinking within our program. So I always like to say that this kind of hands-on and learn by doing is a very classical, old approach for everyone who wanted to make really people learn. So as Confucius said, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. So learn by doing, and this is basically our motto here at Cal Poly, is the way to go when it comes to education. So the outline of today's presentation, quickly, a quick background on gamification as a pedagogical approach. I'll try to make sure that we pick up a couple of things about the importance of this approach from an education and pedagogical perspective, and then how does this relate to lean education, and how can we, or what did I do to try to assess the impact of this gamification approach and using the ARCS model. And then the specific project that we conducted here at Cal Poly with the students, and then the sample of the results. And I'll not really dwell a lot on the details of the results. I'll try to really spend some time more on the discussion and the main takeaways and findings on that research. The research is published already, and I'll share with you the journal paper based on this. So basically, it's a long list of the researchers and different institutions that conducted a lot of studies on the impact of gamification. This is a result from University of Colorado at Denver about the impact of using games in general for teaching and training. And this is the results they found, that basically it leads to higher retention rate, higher factual knowledge, higher self-efficiency, and it's proven to be working in a sense. And when we speak about gamification, we are really speaking about how can you enhance the typical learning cycle. A learning cycle usually has an emotional component into it. You need to excite students, relate to motivate them, relate to their emotions in a sense, so that they can start to pay attention. And then there is a clear cognitive component in that education cycle or learning cycle, where they engage mentally and try to understand the element that you or the content that you're trying to teach them. And all this happens in a social setup that also has its own impact and influence on that learning and educational process. So keep this in mind, because these are the elements of education assessment that will be used in this study: emotional, cognitive, and social elements, and how a successful pedagogical approach should really cater for these three spheres of education. And we'll see that the gamification definitely do that. So, and again, if we would like to just give a quick background about how the gamification approach is based on multiple underpinning pedagogical philosophies, so or approaches. So one famous approach in learn by doing is the constructivist knowledge sharing approach, where the theory basically says that it is the interaction between the learner and the educator and the participants that construct knowledge. And indeed, the game approach and gamification abide with that, lands perfectly with this, because basically it's through that game and through that interaction we generate and pass on knowledge to students. Also, the situated learning philosophy, where basically this philosophy says that learning happens based on the situation the learner in. It's basically an extension. Learning is an extension of the environment that the learning individual is in. And when you put students in this gamified environment, or try to really mimic a real environment through a game, you situate them in an environment that will pass on and disseminate knowledge to them. The problem-based learning process, again, another very famous learn by doing approach, where basically it states that students learn if they are engaged in a problem-solving approach, and gamification does that. In a sense, there is a problem where the game basically is developed and designed trying to solve that problem, whether in a competitive or a cooperative way, but it aligns with that. And also, it's a very famous tool in that learn by doing school or pedagogical lineup that relates to active learning, right? And statistics basically say, or the studies on that active learning philosophy says that basically, if you are in the passive mode of learning, the maximum you can get out from the students doesn't go beyond 50% of what they hear and see. If you really engage in a good hearing and seeing approach, in a sense. But if you get them really to start to engage with that educational process, whether through writing or through doing, and this is basically what games will do, definitely, you end up with a very high retention level of knowledge. This is what they call active learning. So this slide just basically to confirm that the underpinning pedagogical philosophy of gamification is aligning with many of the popular active learning, learn by doing theories out there. I'm not specialized in education or the pedagogy of learn by doing, but I spent some time trying to understand why gamification works and what's the underpinning philosophy behind that. And these four basically theories were standing out there and clearly highlighted why students are more motivated and engaged when it comes to gamification. When it comes to game design, and this is a very important also aspect of what we're trying to discuss today, it's an art in a sense that you try to balance between the challenge or the complexity of the game and the skills development of students, right? To produce or develop what they call the flow channel of engagement. Because if you design a game or you try to get students in a game that's very challenging and unclear, for example, and especially at the early stage of the course, where even the whole concept of lean and lean thinking is not there yet, you will create different forms of anxiety, worrisome. You will lose them in a sense. And on the other end of the spectrum, if it's too easy of a game and their skills is already beyond that, or they know a lot of that stuff already, This can be, you can be in that boredom, relaxed zone, and instead of engaging students, they're just disengaged because it's too boring or too easy. But it's that skill of trying to create that flow that you keep increasing the challenge, the complexity of the game as you are upskilling the level of your students, and in our context here, as they learn more and more about lean principles and lean thinking in a sense. And you'll find the impact of this seamless flow in the results that I'll be showing. Some games managed to do that, others basically was not as flowing as others in a sense. But this is also a very important background when you speak about gamification in general. With this background, we can start to speak also about the different types of gamification that's out there, and that also can be very relevant to lean education. This is a nice typology that speak about the different simulation-based games. And you can see that there are two general categories. There is the computer-based simulation, and it's also a very famous, popular gamification approach. And there is the non-computer based, the more physical, engaging games. And I'm basically focusing more on that. This is what I was interested in. And specifically the role-playing subcategory of that category, where students are trying to really take a role and a physical engagement in a game, either trying to play the role of a worker or a manager or an assembly personnel or a customer. And my whole lean course and lab basically is designed on how can we engage students in this hands-on physical engaging simulation game. So whatever we're going to be discussing today, especially in terms of the results, belong to that category, and specifically the interactive role-playing, even not the non-interactive ones. But this is a nice also typology to see the different landscape of games that you can adopt if you would like to go about gamification in general. Okay, so now let's move on to lean gamification, and indeed trying to pass on lean principles and knowledge through games is not something that's new for you who have been engaged in training and consulting, for example, about lean principles. There are a lot of things going on there, right? The very famous paper plane game, the Toyota assembly line, the dice games. There are a lot of games out there. So it's not new, but what was challenging basically and what posed the question of this research and interest for me was, is it really appropriate to just import all these games that's coming from industry, given a background of long practice and experience for both the trainer and the trainees? Can we just take it as is and use it in classrooms? And I basically was doubting that this is appropriate, and results showed that a lot of the games that were assuming some kind of practical experience were challenging for some students. So this research basically was trying to understand the impact of gamification on students, and how can we better design these games so that they can align into the higher education context better. So these are the two challenges I just spoke about them, academic challenge and practical challenge. So we need to look into the games, because most of the games I adopted were games basically that were out there for industry. I took a lot of them, maybe adjusted some of them, but many of them I just really want, for the sake of exploring and experimentation, I just used it with the students, and there were different reactions for that. So what tool I used to assess basically the impact of students' engagement using the gamification approach? I used a very famous tool in the educational domain called the ARCS, abbreviation basically for attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction. It's a classical tool that try to assess the motivation generated and increased and improved during a learning process by trying really to look into attention, which refers to the response of the learner for the perceived instruction. These instruction that this learning approach stimulate their attention, arouse their interest, for example. Relevance here refer to how learners associate their prior learning experience to the instruction. Can they relate to this game, for example? Can they relate to this learning tool, or is it something that doesn't relate to any of the backgrounds? Confidence, basically, this is a very important aspect in that motivation assessment, and it relates to the positive expectation of learners that they can do the job and do the task. And this is also very important when it comes to the student context, because if you really create a game that's very challenging, you'll have a low confidence level, because the expectation of success is and success is not, and that confidence level is not related to whether it's really difficult or not. It's a perception that the learner will have at the beginning of the game and during the game, whether they can do it or not. And again, it's very interesting element, because the concept of failure here is a very delicate concept, because we always basically learn through failure, and even the very famous lean concept of continuous improvement. You either improve based on a success or you improve based on a failure, right? So there is a failure element in many of the games and in many of the gamification approaches that we'll be using in this lean course that I had. But confidence here is how much you can give the students a perception that they can still do it. Even if there is a failure, it's part of what they need to learn and build on it, in a sense. So confidence is something that also will be measured here as part of the ARCS model. Then satisfaction basically usually comes based on the previous three elements, and this is basically how learners end up at the end of that learning process and feel good about basically what they learned, and whether they can practically walk away with it and practice it by themselves or not. So this model, the ARCS, is a very famous model for assessment of motivation and the emotional content of the learning process. Remember, we had the emotional, the cognitive, and the social elements. So for the emotional motivational element, this basically was the tool that I used. I added on top of that, as you're going to see, a couple of assessment questions also for the cognitive part and for the social element. And basically, this was the research methodology. I took the questionnaire, the assessment tool that already was built by multiple researchers that used the ARCS model. I modified it a little bit to be appropriate for the lean context that we are using. But basically, this is what I use. So this is the tool, basically, a bunch of questions to assess the attention of the students, relevance. So, and the students, this is the questionnaire that the students filled after playing the game, after every single class, basically, and playing the game. Bunch of questions for attention, relevance, confidence, only just one question for satisfaction. And for the cognitive area, basically, I tried to measure the intrinsic cognitive load and the germane cognitive load. One of them is about basically the cognitive effort that students invested in to play the game and understand the game, while basically the germane cognitive load relates to how difficult was it to really store that knowledge and process it, in a sense. So again, simple questions on the same Likert scale, just to capture that cognitive load. And in terms of the social element of the full cycle, remember we said emotional, cognitive, and social. On the social aspect, two elements basically were captured by a bunch of questions. One of them is the cooperative interaction and the team dynamics, basically. And the other one is the competitive interaction. So within the team and across different teams, playing the games in the class, to see basically how that social element will play out in the overall engagement of students in that lean education process. So this is basically the pedagogical background and the research approach that I used in that research to assess the engagement of students in using the lean gamification approach. This was basically the sample size was 120 students over 4 different classes, graduate and undergraduate students over a whole academic year. These are the games basically that I used. One game for value stream mapping called the Lean Squad, one for the push and pull principles, the typical Toyota assembly line, the very basic mousetrap game, the kids game basically for highlighting the continuous improvement in the PDCA cycle, a game for quality, Torch Factory, a game for line balancing, the beer game for lean supply chain, and again, the concept of variation, variability, and information sharing, and a game for process control using the classical catapult game for Y equal function X. Different lean concepts that the course basically wanted to pass on to students. And I classified the games basically in the research to easy, moderate, and difficult in terms of which games will take longer times, more analytical and quantitative maybe skills, and also in terms of the number of tasks required. Just to give an extra lens, would the game difficulty basically play a role in this or not? So let me now share with you some of the results. These are just some pictures of the students playing, and this is the paper that I published of that work. And I'll share with you some of the overall results and then move on to the discussion so that we can have some time for Q&A and comments. So this is basically the overall score of the different ARCS questions that the students basically filled for all the games. And remember, this is basically to assess the emotional or the motivational part of the learning cycle. And we can see that most the attention, relevance, and satisfaction were all performing well. The games managed to grab the attention of the students, and they felt some kind of relevance here in terms of their goal perspective, that they managed to really find what they expected in terms of learning. They were satisfied based on that level of attention and relevance. But it's very interesting that the confidence level here was the one that's really struggling a little bit. And again, this is a very important takeaway on designing these games, that how they felt about the perception of success, and whether this was really positively reinforcing or inhibiting students to really continue engaging in the games. Overall, when you put that motivational aspect with the cognitive and the social aspects, you'll find again that overall gamification managed to perform well in this full education cycle. Students were motivated with a good level. They were definitely, the social element is clearly the highest one. And again, this is typical in this kind of setup. You get students playing as a team, competing against one another. You create this kind of zeal and energy. So the social element was very well enhanced with this gamification approach. And again, the cognitive element is not performing that bad, but it's not as good as the other two. And again, this is another takeaway that got me to really have a deeper lens and investigation of why was it kind of high in the cognitive load, these games, and is it due to its complexity? Is it due to the clarity of instructions? And this is why I started to look deeper into each of the games. So, and again, this is just a sample of some of the results. I compared all the 9 games that I used over the course of the 8 games. You'll find that games are varying here. And again, I'm not going into the details of that, but definitely games varied based on their simplicity and difficulty, based on the amount of role playing, either even that they had some games were a little bit passive games, like for example, visual management, where they had to design an SOP, for example, versus a game of line balancing, for example, where they had to go and measure and come back. And so the social element here was different. However, the simplicity also and complexity played an important role here. And I came up with multiple assessment for my own games, in a sense, which games I had to maybe revisit, increase the instruction and the lecturing maybe before the games, and which games basically were doing well and I just kept as is. So drawing on that, I came up with some recommendations for game designers, in a sense, in our lean context, and for educators who would like to either use an available game or would like to design their own game. So here are some of these recommendations. The first one is we have to make sure that the games we are selecting are games basically that are fulfilling the full learning cycle. So there is the motivation, emotional element into it. There is the cognitive element into it. There is the social element into them. Because if you fulfill these cycles through through the gamification approach, you will get students more engaged and better learning. On a different research, basically published later, I also assessed the knowledge retention by doing some questionnaire before and after, and the games basically managed to increase the knowledge retention to around above 40%. So if we abide by that learning cycle and the games manage to do that, you really not just get them engaged, but also they learn well. Motivating students to engage in lean thinking is highly related with how you design the game's component, the design of the game itself, the instructions, the layout of the game, the materials. And this is why I'm a more fan of the physical games rather than the computer-based games. And this is why that 1 year and a half, the pandemic year, 1 year and a half of the pandemic, online teaching was a struggle for me. I can share with you still we played some games, but not as engaging as when we were all on the same production line and we have multiple production lines competing against one another. So motivation is highly related to the topology and the physical design of the game itself. I saw the challenge of the direct import of just games from used in industry and assuming the practical experience of the attendees. Relevance will suffer in some specific games because students didn't really relate to that, and you can reduce this by, as I said, extra maybe teaching or case studies so that they can relate to some of these concepts. But there was a challenge there. The cognitive element of the game design is critical, as I said, and it relates to the satisfaction of the students. You don't want students to walk away over challenged and really cognitively exhausted. So you need to balance between, as I said, the complexity and the upskilling that's happening to the students, maintain that flow. This is very important to ensure that it's a successful gamification approach. The social element of the games was definitely the most prevalent success element in all the three, among the motivation, the emotion, the cognitive and the social. The social element in the higher education among students is something that you need to capitalize on. So make sure that the games have enough rules for everybody. Everybody is engaged in a meaningful way. Social processing basically was the highest scoring in all games, and students like that the most. So I think this is an important point to leverage on. And basically, the concept of failure, it's very important how you frame that to students through the concept of continuous improvement, learning through failure. Failure here is just part of the learning process. It's not a challenge. It shouldn't be seen as a challenge. And last but not least, basically, students will mostly engage in more games that basically they perceived as motivating and satisfactory for them. So make sure that you design along these lines. So I think I'm almost on time, right? Half an hour as I was given. So let me pause here and let's switch it to a more engaged and gamified discussion. You can ask me and share your experience with that.
Wonderful, Amit. Really appreciate those insights and sort of the experiences that you found from your own research about how to make gamification work. I mean, obviously, what you're talking about here has relevance not just for Lean, but more broadly in terms of educational process. So we do have a few questions here. So one of the questions that's come up from a couple of our audiences is there a place where people can easily find some of these different games that are out there for teaching Lean? I mean, I'm personally not aware of a single repository, but are you aware of any sites that sort of bring these?
So the answer is no. So there is no one single place, and the part of what I went through was basically trying to see what's available in the market, so this research was coming out of a grant that I had to buy a lot of these kits, and I ended up buying stuff from the US, from UK, things that I developed by myself and some of the games. So I can definitely share maybe with you, Vijay, and you can share with everybody some of the suppliers basically that I had these games from. And also the publication that I had from that research. So I'll be happy to share that with everyone.
Excellent. That's great. I think there's certainly an opportunity to sort of pull this together to simplify the use of these educational resources. Another question here is, would you suggest doing games that reflect the industry that employees are in, or something simpler that they can apply more in a sort of personal daily setting?
I don't want to say a mix of both, but definitely if the more industrial or a manufacturing or a service facing that the game has, the more they feel that it's really practical, but it should be simple. So for example, I'll share with you. So I had a struggling experience with the students, for example, when we played the game for SMED, for example, single minute exchange of die. And students couldn't relate really to a lot of, it was a complicated game in a sense, and a lot of elements were trying to mimic the change over time and the different internal external processes versus, for example, a simple assembly line. So it's still a manufacturing line, but this was very easy for the students to really relate to. They either worked in an assembly line in a restaurant, for example, or in a real factory. So it depends on what kind of facing. So make it practical as much as you can, but not that detailed and complicated. The same, for example, I had a nice game for TPM, Total Productive Maintenance, and again, to get students to try to envision what happens over a year through this machine that simulates the wear and tear. It takes extra teaching and extra engaging students in what does this really mean, practically speaking, versus simple manufacturing applications that they can relate to.
Great. So here's another question for you. What would you consider to be the best Lean game for use among students?
Well, the best Lean game is the game that gets students to see the impact of the PDCA cycle and the continuous improvement with any of the tools that you are teaching them. So if you can get them to really play 3-4 rounds and they can see that the whatever KPI you're looking at is improving, time, quality, whatever, in a time frame of 1 hour, 1 hour and a half, this is an amazing game. Get them to really see that it works and it improves the system, and that the process improvement is really something that exists, versus a game that takes a long time to make a delta. Students are not appreciative of that. Even if you tell them that this delta improvement is very good in industry, they really don't relate to that as much. So these games basically give students more confidence and belief in what they are learning.
Excellent. So I will point out, and we'll try to make sure we get this shared. There are a couple of other links that have been provided to us in the Q&A, which we'll try to get shared out about some other additional sites that do have access to some Lean games. I know that's been a big point of discussion here. We've got time for one more question here, and with this question, I'm going to sort of focus on the research itself. And a question that was asked is, in terms of the increase in confidence that you saw among students in game mode, do you have any evidence about whether this tended to increase over experience with games, or was there only a single data collection? So I think this is a really important point in terms of ongoing sort of cognitive benefit to the students.
Yeah, so if I understand the question correctly, so confidence, I tracked confidence over the, we teach here in quarter mode, so over the 10 weeks of the quarter, and definitely the confidence score on week 1 was far lower than the confidence score at week 10. However, this is not the only element here. That I said there is a complexity also element of the game itself. So definitely confidence with what I classified as easy games were higher than what I classified as difficult games. So there is the learning curve element, there is the game complexity element, and also I have to say that there is the teaching element in this whole gamification approach. I still lecture, right? So the way it worked out was we meet twice a week, so I speak about the concept in general in the first lecture, and I don't really go over the whole thing intentionally, and then we go and play a game on the second meeting so that they can relate to that concept. So it depends on also how much did they grab from that theoretical staging of the game. In many cases helps that confidence level to really raise. Some games I just get them, I indulge them into the game directly without any teaching, because the teaching will only be through the wrap up and debrief that we do at the end. And these games, I see them struggling more as we go, right? And that struggle sometimes is part, as I said, of the teaching experience or the learning experience they need to go through, but the confidence suffer in this kind of context. So you can reduce that confidence struggling and that cognitive load, and both of them, by the way, are related to each other. By the learning curve impact, good staging and teaching, and trying to simplify games a little bit, don't really overcomplicate it.
Excellent, thanks for that insight, Amit. So we're already pushing 10:40 here in the Mountain Time, so I think we probably want to, in the interests of people's time, sort of bring this session to a close. A couple of things to note. I see some additional requests for details about games to deal with specific topics such as product development, line balancing. What we'll try to do is we'll try to sort of, as I've mentioned, there are a couple of sites out there which do sort of list some of these different games. And again, we'll try to sort of do what we can to sort of compile some of that and get that out to the folks on the call this morning. A couple of you have asked questions specifically about the research itself. I would certainly encourage you to sort of reach out to Amit. I'm sure Amit would be more than happy to sort of give you a much more.
And I can share with you the paper itself. Yeah. So Vijay, would you like me to send you the paper and then you send it to the whole list, or send it to Mary maybe, and she can send it to the whole list?
I would say if you were to send it to Mary, then we can make sure we have the folks who are interested in that kind of access, and then they can reach out for hopefully some productive follow-up conversations with you.
Absolutely, I'll do that. My pleasure.
Great. Well, again, thanks to everybody. Appreciate you taking the time to join with us. I think Amit shared some really interesting insights here. I think some of the things he's talked about here clearly have application not just in the higher education sector, but in terms of the training and consultancy sector, in terms of how do we sort of help folks who are new or just trying to sort of advance their sophistication with some of these issues to be more familiar with what's out there and use practice and as a way of improving their knowledge. Again, thank you all for joining us this morning. Again, those of you who might have other ideas for sessions in this series of webinars on lead education, please do contact me or contact Mary Price. Would certainly love to hear from you. What we want to do is make sure that we are doing what we can to sort of add value to the network of educators who are focused on issues related to lead. Thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday and wonderful rest of your summer.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you, guys.